So let's have a glimpse into the teaching of the Master, Sri J. Krishnamurti. I'm going to read out a paragraph, what I call a sutra, from his work, The First and Last Freedom, one of his earlier works, very intense work. And we'll take that paragraph and we will look at it in an attempt to understand what the Master is saying. Do we know what we mean by the self? Whether it is projected outwardly in action or projected spiritually as virtue, the striving after all this is the self. In it is included the competition, the desire to be. The whole process of that is the self. And we know actually, when we are faced with it, that it is an evil thing. I am using the word evil intentionally because the self is dividing, the self is self-enclosing, its activities, however noble, are separative and isolating. We know all this. Quotations close. So we've got to understand this, and when we look at this, we will find this to be a very strange passage from religious literature, because nobody ever talks about the self. And Krishnamurti is a very unusual kind of master and world teacher who has ushered in a very silent inner revolution and a paradigm shift in the religious life of mankind, in that he did not build religious institutions, notwithstanding being a world teacher. He had no disciples whatsoever, and he did not ask you to follow him, no disciples, no followers, and he just wants you to inquire and wants you to explore yourself, so that fleeing from the lesser planes of belief and faith, you may come to discover the truth yourself. So that's the whole tenor of Krishnamurti. And here in this passage, the Master is talking about self-knowing. And what is very noteworthy is that the Master has identified this as a very evil force. And we may be shocked when we first hear these words from the Master, but we have to remember that if you go back to the traditional Hindu Shaivite literature, then you find the universally present icon of Nataraja, or the dancing form of Lord Shiva, and in that sculpture or in that brass icon, you will find the right foot of Lord Shiva pressing down on a seemingly infant figure with an evil face, and that figure represents the Apasmara Purusha. Now, Purusha is a yogic term. It means self, and in terms of the nomenclature of the Gita, Purusha is the same as Jivatma, and that is what Krishnamurti calls the self. It is a very separative kind of energy, which is divisive, which is cunning, which is self-enclosing, which is calculative, and it is overtly or covertly waging a war for its self-preservation with the whole of life. Now, some of you who have observed this, the movement of the self within yourself, may agree with this, and some others who may not have watched the self at work may not vote for this, that the self is so scheming, the self is so cunning, the self is so divisive, and the self is so disruptive. You may not vote for this. because you may not have observed from an impartial perspective how the self conducts itself in the day-to-day life, in thought and in behavior and in feeling and in action. But when you do observe, you will find that the self is very divisive, and the self is very calculative, and it is very self-preservative, and it is always positioning itself against the rest of the world. Whoever may be on the other side of the line, maybe an individual, maybe a family, maybe another religion, maybe another country, then it's a conflict between one country and another country, conflict between one religion and another religion, conflict between one political ideology and another political ideology. So whatever it is, there is a sense of division, and the self is making the havoc of this division. And Krishnamurti's emphasis is on the paramount importance of having to watch the self at work. And in his view, if you watch the self without judgment or criticism or condemnation, but only purely with a view to understand it, which means there is an intention to understand the behavior of the self, then the self is seen to undergo a very palpable calming and silencing, which was not even expected, because we did not know that such a thing will happen in the first place, but it did happen, it came to pass, and that may be the milestone ushering in a new chapter of real spiritual life, or indeed true religious life. And that's where the master comes in. He is asking you to begin from inside. He is not asking you to look outside, and he is asking you to be compassionate with yourself, and is asking you to study this extremely divisive and disruptive energy. And in Amanaska Yoga, this is highlighted, and this is the whole tenor and direction of Amanaska Yoga as well, except that we continuously move from the Krishnamurtian universe to the universe of what the traditional religions are saying about the self, and thereby bridge the gap between tradition and what the world teacher is saying. So that is our whole work in Amanaska Yoga.